My name is Linda Holloway, and if you're looking for a story about giving up, you've come to the wrong place. At 69 years old, I've learned that life isn't about the cards you're dealt. It's about how you play them, and more importantly, how you help others play theirs. I was born in 1955 in Seattle, Washington, during a time when the world was still recovering from war and learning to hope again. My story isn't one of fame or fortune. It's about something far more valuable, the power of one person to make a difference in the lives of children who had nowhere else to turn. For 40 years, I worked as a social worker, dedicating my life to protecting children in situations most people couldn't even imagine. I've walked into homes where innocence was shattered, where small voices were silenced by fear, and where hope seemed like a luxury no one could afford. But I've also witnessed miracles. Children who found their strength, families that healed, and communities that came together to protect their most vulnerable members. People often ask me how I did it for so long, how I faced the darkness day after day without losing myself in it. The answer lies in a single moment when I was 31 years old, a rescue that changed everything about how I saw my purpose in this world. That day taught me that sometimes we're not just saving children, we're saving the future itself. My journey hasn't been easy. I've been divorced, I've faced my own demons, and I've made mistakes that still keep me awake at night. But I've also been honored for my community work, built a network of friendships that sustain me, and learned that a life lived in service to others is never a life wasted. If my story resonates with you, I encourage you to stay with me through this journey. Because this isn't just my story, it's a story about all of us, about our responsibility to protect those who can't protect themselves, and about the incredible strength that ordinary people can find when they decide to make a difference. I came into this world on a crisp October morning in 1955, the second child of Margaret and Robert Holloway. My parents weren't wealthy by any stretch of the imagination, but they were rich in the things that mattered most: love, integrity, and an unshakable belief that every person deserved dignity and respect. My father worked at the Boeing plant, his hands perpetually stained with grease and his back bent from years of labor. But when he came home each evening, he'd wash those hands carefully and scoop me up as if I were the most precious thing in the world. My mother worked part-time as a seamstress, her fingers dancing across fabric with the same gentle precision she used when she'd tend to my scraped knees or comfort me after a nightmare. Growing up in post-war Seattle meant growing up in a community that understood struggle. Our neighborhood was filled with families who'd been touched by loss, fathers who'd returned from war different than when they'd left, mothers who'd held families together with nothing but determination and prayer. But it was also a place where people looked out for each other, where no child went hungry if someone knew about it, and where community meant something real and tangible. I was 8 years old when I first understood that not all children lived the way I did. Mrs. Henderson lived 3 houses down with her grandson, Tommy, a boy about my age who rarely spoke and always seemed to be looking over his shoulder. I'd see him sitting on their front steps, his clothes too big and his eyes too old for his face. One afternoon, I heard shouting coming from their house. Through our kitchen window, I watched as Tommy ran into the street, tears streaming down his face. My mother immediately went to him, kneeling down to his level and speaking in that soft voice she used when I was frightened. She brought him into our kitchen, made him a sandwich, and called Mrs. Henderson. What I learned that day was that Tommy's father, Mrs. Henderson's son, had problems with drinking. When he drank, he got angry, and when he got angry, Tommy bore the brunt of it. My mother didn't just send Tommy home with a full belly, she made it her business to check on him regularly. She'd find reasons to visit Mrs. Henderson, bringing extra portions of dinner or offering to watch Tommy when his father was having bad days. That was my first lesson in what it meant to step in when someone was hurting. My mother never made a big production of it. She never called the authorities or made grand speeches. She simply showed up consistently and quietly, making sure a vulnerable child knew someone cared about his safety. As I grew older, I realized this wasn't unusual behavior in our family. My parents were always helping someone, whether it was my father staying late to help a coworker who was struggling to keep up, or my mother taking in sewing from neighbors who needed extra income but couldn't afford to pay much. They never talked about it as charity or good deeds. It was simply what you did when you were part of a community. School came easily to me, but more than academics, I was drawn to people. I was the kid who ate lunch with whoever was sitting alone, who partnered with the students others avoided, who seemed to have a radar for anyone who needed a friend. My teachers noticed this quality and often asked me to help new students feel welcome or to work with classmates who were struggling. By the time I was in high school, I knew I wanted to work with children, not as a teacher, but as someone who could help kids who were facing the kinds of problems Tommy had faced. I didn't know exactly what that would look like, but I knew it was my calling. The seeds of my future were planted in those early years in Seattle, watered by parents who showed me that ordinary people could do extraordinary things simply by caring enough to act. They taught me that protecting children wasn't someone else's job. It was everyone's responsibility. The late 1960s and early 1970s were turbulent times to come of age. While my peers were protesting the Vietnam War and challenging authority, I found myself drawn to a different kind of activism, one that happened in quiet moments in individual conversations, and in the spaces where society's most vulnerable members struggled alone. After graduating high school in 1973, I enrolled at the University of Washington to study social work. It wasn't a glamorous field. The pay was terrible, the hours were long, and the emotional toll was something no textbook could prepare you for. But I'd found my calling, and nothing was going to deter me from pursuing it. College opened my eyes to the broader systems that failed children. I learned about poverty, about cycles of abuse, about how bureaucracy could sometimes harm the very people it was meant to protect. But I also learned about resilience, about the incredible capacity children have to heal and grow when given the right support and opportunities. My professors were a mix of idealists and realists, each bringing their own perspective to the complex world of child welfare. Dr. Patricia Mendez became my mentor, a woman who'd been working in the field for 20 years and had seen everything from miraculous recoveries to heartbreaking failures. She taught me that good intentions weren't enough. You needed knowledge, skills, and, most importantly, the ability to maintain professional boundaries while still allowing yourself to care deeply. During my junior year, I completed my first field placement at a residential facility for children who'd been removed from their homes. Walking into that building for the first time, I was struck by how normal it looked from the outside, just another brick building in downtown Seattle. But inside, it housed 37 children ranging in age from 4 to 17, each carrying stories that would make grown adults weep. There was Maria, a 7-year-old who'd been found living alone in an apartment after her mother disappeared. She hadn't spoken a word since arriving at the facility 6 months earlier. There was David, a teenager whose parents had kicked him out when they discovered he was gay. And there was little Amy, barely 5 years old, who flinched every time an adult raised their voice, even in normal conversation. Working with these children taught me that trauma doesn't discriminate. It doesn't care about race, religion, or socioeconomic status. It finds its way into families where you'd least expect it, and it leaves marks that aren't always visible to the naked eye. But it also taught me about hope, because children, even those who've experienced unimaginable pain, have an incredible capacity for healing when they're given safety, consistency, and unconditional positive regard. My supervisor at the facility was Janet Walsh, a seasoned social worker who'd been advocating for children for 15 years. Janet was tough, she had to be, but she also had the biggest heart I'd ever encountered. She taught me how to write reports that told a child's story without reducing them to a case number, how to navigate court systems that were often more concerned with efficiency than justice, and how to advocate for children even when it meant challenging judges, lawyers, and other professionals who thought they knew better. One case during that placement changed my perspective forever. A 12-year-old boy named Marcus had been in and out of the system since he was 6. Multiple foster placements had failed, and everyone labeled him as difficult and oppositional. Most people had written him off as one of those kids who would age out of the system without ever finding a permanent home. But Janet saw something different in Marcus. She spent hours talking with him, not about his behavior problems, but about his interests, his dreams, his fears. Slowly, she uncovered the truth. Marcus wasn't difficult, he was terrified. Every time he started to bond with a foster family, he'd sabotage the relationship because he'd learned that leaving before getting attached hurt less than being abandoned again. Janet worked tirelessly to find Marcus a family who understood trauma and were prepared to weather the storms that would inevitably come. It took months of searching, countless interviews, and multiple failed attempts. But finally, she found the Johnsons, an older couple whose own children were grown and who had experience with adoption. The day Marcus moved in with the Johnsons was the day I truly understood what this work was about. It wasn't about fixing broken children or rescuing them from bad situations. It was about believing in their capacity to heal and grow, and then creating the conditions that made healing possible. In 1977, at 22 years old, I graduated with my bachelor's in social work and landed my first job with Child Protective Services in King County. I was young, idealistic, and completely unprepared for the reality of what I'd signed up for. My caseload was 37 families, and within my first week, I'd seen things that would haunt me for years to come. My supervisor, Robert Chin, was a man in his 50s who'd been doing this work since before I was born. He had kind eyes that had seen too much and a gentle way of speaking that could calm even the most agitated parent or frightened child. On my first day, he sat me down in his cluttered office and gave me advice that would shape the rest of my career. "Linda," he said, "this job will break your heart 100 times over. You'll lie awake at night wondering if you made the right decision, if you could have done more, if you're really making any difference at all. But I need you to remember something. For every case that doesn't turn out the way you hoped, there's a child somewhere who's alive and safe because of the work we do. You might never know their names, but they're out there." My first case involved the Thompson family, a mother struggling with addiction and 3 children under the age of 8 living in conditions that no child should have to endure. The apartment was filthy, there was little food in the refrigerator, and the children were clearly malnourished and neglected. But Mrs. Thompson wasn't a monster. She was a woman who'd lost her way, whose own childhood trauma had never been addressed, and who was medicating her pain in the only way she knew how. The easy solution would have been to remove the children immediately. It would have been safer, cleaner, more straightforward. But I'd learned from Janet and Dr. Mendez that the easy solution isn't always the right solution. Children belong with their families when it's possible to make that safe, and breaking up a family should always be the last resort, not the first option. I spent months working with Mrs. Thompson, connecting her with addiction treatment services, helping her apply for assistance programs, and teaching her basic parenting skills that no one had ever taught her. It was slow, frustrating work. There were setbacks and relapses, times when I questioned whether I was doing the right thing by keeping the family together. But gradually, things began to improve. Mrs. Thompson completed a treatment program and started attending Narcotics Anonymous meetings. The children's health improved. They started attending school regularly, and slowly, their apartment began to feel like a home instead of just a place where people happened to live. Not all of my cases had happy endings. The Martinez family was one of my early failures, though I didn't realize it at the time. Mr. Martinez was charming and articulate, always had explanations for the bruises on his 8-year-old son Carlos, and was skilled at making me feel like the problem was my inexperience rather than his behavior. I wanted to believe him. Carlos never said anything about being hurt at home, and Mr. Martinez was always cooperative, always willing to attend parenting classes or counseling sessions. But there were signs I should have paid more attention to: the way Carlos flinched when his father reached toward him, the drawings he made in school that depicted violence, the gradual withdrawal from activities he'd previously enjoyed. 6 months into my involvement with the family, Carlos was hospitalized with injuries that could no longer be explained away. A broken arm, cracked ribs, and cigarette burns on his back told a story that Mr. Martinez's charm couldn't rewrite. Carlos was immediately removed from the home, and I was left wondering how I'd missed the signs, how I'd let my inexperience and desire to keep families together blind me to a child's suffering. That case taught me one of the hardest lessons of my career: that sometimes protecting children means making decisions that feel like failures. Sometimes keeping a family together isn't the right choice, and sometimes being wrong has consequences that you'll carry with you for the rest of your life. But it also taught me to trust my instincts more, to look beyond what people presented on the surface, and to always remember that my primary responsibility was to the children, not to the adults in their lives. Carlos eventually went to live with his grandmother, where he thrived. He stayed in touch with me for several years, sending me drawings and school photos that showed a boy who was finally allowed to be a child. The work was emotionally exhausting, but it was also deeply fulfilling. Every day brought new challenges, new families, new opportunities to make a difference. I was learning to navigate complex family dynamics, to work with other professionals who didn't always share my priorities, and to advocate for children in systems that weren't always designed with their best interests in mind. By 1980, I'd been working in child protective services for 3 years and had found my rhythm. I was no longer the nervous young woman who second-guessed every decision. I developed confidence in my abilities, learned to trust my instincts, and built a reputation as someone who would fight tirelessly for the children on her caseload. It was during this time that I met James Patterson at a community fundraiser for foster children. He was a police officer, tall and handsome, with kind eyes and a laugh that could fill a room. James understood the weight of my work in ways that other men I'd dated couldn't. He'd seen some of the same darkness I had made some of the same impossible decisions, and carried some of the same burdens. Our relationship developed slowly, built on long conversations about justice, morality, and what it meant to serve your community. James had a way of listening that made me feel heard and understood. He never tried to fix my bad days or tell me I was too sensitive when I came home emotionally drained. Instead, he'd hold me when I cried and remind me of the children I'd helped when I focused too much on the ones I couldn't save. We married in 1982 in a small ceremony at my parents' church. James's family and mine mixed together easily. And for the first time since starting my career, I began to think about what it might mean to have my own children, to create the kind of safe, loving home that I worked so hard to provide for other people's kids. Marriage changed me in ways I hadn't expected. Coming home to James each evening provided a buffer against the trauma I witnessed during my workdays. We'd cook dinner together, sharing stories about our days, finding ways to process the difficult aspects of our jobs while also celebrating the victories, however small they might be. James was promoted to detective in 1983, specializing in crimes against children. This meant we were often working on complementary aspects of the same cases. He'd investigate the criminal side, while I worked on child protection and family services. It was both a blessing and a challenge, as we learned to navigate the intersection of our professional and personal lives. Our partnership extended beyond our marriage. James and I became a team that other professionals respected and relied on. Judges knew that when we both appeared in court on behalf of a child, we'd done our homework and were presenting a thorough, well-considered recommendation. Other social workers and police officers began consulting with us on difficult cases, recognizing that our combined expertise could help them make better decisions. In 1984, I was promoted to senior social worker, a position that came with increased responsibilities and more complex cases. I was now supervising newer workers, helping them navigate the same challenges I'd faced when I was starting out. I found that I enjoyed teaching and mentoring, sharing not just the technical aspects of the job, but also the emotional skills necessary to survive and thrive in such demanding work. One of the workers I supervised during this time was Patricia Gomez, a recent college graduate who reminded me of myself at that age, passionate, determined, but sometimes overwhelmed by the enormity of the problems she encountered. Patricia was assigned to a case involving suspected sexual abuse of a 4-year-old girl named Sarah, and she was struggling with how to proceed. The challenge with cases involving very young children is that they often can't articulate what's happened to them, or they've been threatened into silence. Physical evidence might be minimal or ambiguous, and adults involved might be skilled at presenting themselves as caring and responsible. Patricia was frustrated by the lack of clear proof and worried about making the wrong decision. I worked closely with Patricia on Sarah's case, teaching her to look for patterns of behavior rather than focusing solely on explicit disclosure. We observed how Sarah interacted with different adults, documented changes in her behavior over time, and created safety plans that protected her while we gathered more information. It was painstaking work that required patience and skill. Eventually, Sarah began to open up during play therapy sessions, revealing through dolls and drawings what she couldn't yet say in words. The investigation confirmed our suspicions, and Sarah was moved to a safe placement with relatives who could protect her. Patricia learned valuable lessons about trusting the process and recognizing that protecting children sometimes requires acting on professional judgment, even when concrete proof is limited. My marriage to James was happy during those early years, but the demands of our jobs began to take a toll. We were both seeing humanity at its worst on a daily basis, and sometimes we brought that darkness home with us despite our best efforts. We'd have dinner conversations about child abuse cases, spend weekends in court testifying about family violence, and find ourselves emotionally exhausted even during what were supposed to be relaxing moments. Still, we supported each other through the difficult cases and celebrated the successes together. When a child we'd both worked to protect was finally adopted by a loving family, we felt like we'd accomplished something meaningful together. When a family we'd helped stay together sent us photos of their children graduating from school or playing sports, we were reminded of why we'd chosen this work. 1986 would prove to be the year that defined not just my career, but my entire understanding of what it meant to be a child advocate. I was 31 years old, had been married to James for 4 years, and had developed a reputation as someone who could handle the most difficult cases. Little did I know that one call on a cold February morning would change everything about how I saw my role in protecting children. The call came in at 7:23 a.m. on a Tuesday. A neighbor had reported hearing a child crying and screaming from the apartment next door for several hours during the night. The police had already been dispatched, but they needed a social worker on scene immediately. James was working a different case that morning, so I drove to the address alone, not knowing what I'd find when I arrived. The apartment building was in a part of Seattle that had seen better days. paint peeled from the siding, broken windows were patched with cardboard, and the smell of neglect hung in the air like a physical presence. Police officers were already there when I arrived, along with paramedics, and what seemed like half the neighborhood crowded on the sidewalk, everyone trying to understand what had happened. Officer Martinez filled me in on the situation as we climbed the stairs to the third floor. "We've got a 6-year-old girl named Emma," he said. "Mother's boyfriend locked her in a closet sometime yesterday. Mother was at work and had no idea. The boyfriend took off sometime during the night, and the mother came home this morning to find her child barely conscious. Nothing in my 8 years of training and experience had prepared me for what I found in that apartment. Emma was so small, so fragile, that she looked more like a 4-year-old than a 6-year-old. She was severely dehydrated, had multiple injuries that clearly weren't accidents, and was so terrified that she couldn't stop shaking even after being wrapped in blankets by the paramedics. But what struck me most was her eyes. They held a kind of terror that no child should ever experience, but also something else, a flicker of hope that maybe, finally, someone was there to help her. When I knelt down to her level and spoke softly, introducing myself and explaining that I was there to make sure she was safe, she reached out with one tiny hand and grabbed onto my finger like it was a lifeline. Emma's mother, Lisa, was a young woman who'd been working double shifts at a factory to support herself and her daughter. She'd left Emma with her boyfriend, believing he cared about them both and could be trusted. The guilt and horror on Lisa's face when she realized what had happened was heartbreaking. She wasn't a bad mother. She was a woman trying to survive in impossible circumstances who'd made a terrible error in judgment about someone she thought she could trust. The next several hours were a blur of hospital visits, police interviews, and emergency court hearings. Emma was hospitalized for dehydration and her injuries, while we worked to ensure her safety and figure out what would happen next. Lisa was cooperative with the investigation, horrified by what her boyfriend had done, and desperate to make sure her daughter was protected. What made this case different from the hundreds of others I'd worked was what happened during Emma's second day in the hospital. I was visiting her when she finally spoke her first words since being found. Looking up at me with those enormous eyes, she whispered, "Are you going to keep me safe now?" It was such a simple question, but it contained everything: hope, fear, trust, and a faith that adults could be counted on to protect children. In that moment, I made a promise to Emma that went beyond my professional obligations. I promised her that I would never stop fighting for children like her, that I would dedicate my life to making sure that what happened to her wouldn't happen to others. The investigation revealed that Emma's abuse had been going on for months, escalating gradually in ways that Lisa hadn't recognized or understood. The boyfriend had been skilled at manipulation, isolating Emma from her mother, convincing Lisa that Emma was just going through a difficult phase when she showed signs of trauma. He'd threatened Emma with worse harm if she told anyone what was happening. Working Emma's case required coordination between multiple agencies and professionals. There were police detectives investigating the criminal aspects, medical professionals treating her physical injuries, therapists helping her process the trauma, attorneys representing her interests in court, and foster care workers preparing a safe placement. My role was to coordinate all of these services while keeping Emma's best interests at the center of every decision. The boyfriend was eventually arrested and charged with multiple felonies, including child abuse, false imprisonment, and assault. The case went to trial 8 months later, and Emma, despite being only 6 years old, had to testify about what happened to her. I'll never forget watching this tiny, brave child tell her story to a room full of strangers, her voice barely above a whisper, but her determination clear. Emma was placed with a foster family who specialized in caring for children who'd experienced severe trauma. Lisa completed parenting classes and therapy, learned to recognize signs of abuse, and worked tirelessly to rebuild her relationship with her daughter. After 2 years of supervised visits and family therapy, Emma was safely returned to her mother's care. But Emma's case didn't end when she went home. It became the defining moment of my career, the case I thought about when other situations seemed hopeless, the reminder of why this work mattered so much. Emma taught me that children's resilience is remarkable, but it requires adults who are willing to fight for them consistently and without compromise. The Emma case changed something fundamental about how I approached my work. What had started as a job became a calling, and what had been dedication became something closer to obsession, though I prefer to think of it as unwavering commitment. By 1988, I had been promoted to supervisor of the Special Investigations Unit, handling the most complex and dangerous cases of child abuse in King County. This new role meant working with a team of experienced social workers, coordinating with law enforcement at the highest levels, and often serving as the department's representative in high-profile cases that drew media attention. The responsibility was enormous, but I'd learned that with Emma's voice echoing in my mind, I could handle almost anything. One of the first major cases I supervised involved what appeared to be an organized child abuse ring operating through a network of daycare centers. The investigation was massive, involving dozens of children, multiple jurisdictions, and coordination with federal agencies. As supervisor, my job was to ensure that each child received appropriate services while also maintaining the integrity of the criminal investigation. The complexity of this case tested every skill I developed over my career. We had children ranging in age from 3 to 8, each requiring different approaches to interviewing and assessment. Some children disclosed abuse immediately, while others were so traumatized they couldn't speak about their experiences. Some families were supportive and cooperative, while others blamed their children or refused to believe that abuse had occurred. Working with Detective Sarah Chun, who had replaced James as my primary law enforcement contact when he transferred to a different unit, we developed protocols for handling large-scale abuse cases that would later be adopted by other jurisdictions across the country. Our approach emphasized trauma-informed practices, coordinated services, and keeping children's therapeutic needs at the center of all decisions. The daycare case resulted in multiple convictions and significant prison sentences for the perpetrators. More importantly, it led to systemic changes in how daycare facilities were licensed and monitored in our state. But what I remember most clearly are the individual children. Michael, who drew pictures of monsters until therapy helped him feel safe again. Jennifer, who stopped speaking for 6 months but eventually found her voice. And David, who taught me that healing happens on children's timelines, not ours. My work during this period didn't go unnoticed. In 1989, I received the Governor's Award for Excellence in Child Protection, recognition that was both humbling and validating. The ceremony was attended by colleagues, families I'd worked with over the years, and Emma, now 9 years old and thriving in her mother's care. Having Emma there to see me receive the award felt like completing a circle. The child who had changed my life was there to witness how that change had rippled outward to help other children. The recognition opened doors to new opportunities. I was invited to speak at conferences about trauma-informed child protection practices, to consult with other agencies developing special investigation units, and to train social workers and law enforcement officers in handling complex abuse cases. These opportunities allowed me to multiply my impact, sharing what I'd learned with professionals who could apply those lessons in their own communities. But success in my professional life was creating strain in my personal life. James and I were growing apart, our relationships suffering under the weight of careers that consumed more and more of our emotional energy. We'd started our marriage as partners fighting the same battles, but over time, we'd become two people living parallel lives, coming home too exhausted to connect with each other. The conversations about having children of our own became less frequent and more fraught. Both of us were seeing the worst of what could happen to children. And both of us were struggling with whether we could create a family while being so immersed in protecting other people's children. The irony wasn't lost on us. We were experts at helping other families heal and thrive, but we couldn't seem to nurture our own relationship. In 1990, I was asked to serve on a statewide task force examining systemic failures in child protection. The appointment was a significant honor, but it required extensive travel and time away from my regular caseload. James supported my participation, understanding that this work could lead to policy changes that would protect thousands of children, but it meant even more time apart and more pressure on our already strained marriage. The task force work was some of the most important I'd ever done. We examined cases where the system had failed children, identified patterns in those failures, and developed recommendations for legislative and policy changes. Our report led to increased funding for child protective services, mandatory training for all staff, and implementation of new oversight mechanisms to ensure accountability. One case we reviewed during the task force work haunts me still. A 7-year-old boy named Marcus had been reported to authorities multiple times by teachers, neighbors, and relatives who were concerned about his welfare. Each time, the assigned social worker had investigated and found insufficient evidence to remove him from his parents' care. Marcus died from his injuries 6 months after our final report was released, just weeks before new policies based on our recommendations would have required a different approach to his case. Marcus's death reminded me that our work isn't academic or theoretical. It's about real children with names and faces and dreams that may never be realized if we fail them. The guilt I felt about not moving faster, not pushing harder for immediate implementation of our recommendations, stays with me even now. Sometimes doing your best isn't enough, and sometimes the children pay the price for our limitations. By 1992, the cracks in my marriage had become irreparable gaps. James and I were two people who'd started with shared dreams but had grown in different directions. He'd transferred to white-collar crime investigations, seeking relief from the child abuse cases that had consumed both of our lives for so many years. I, on the other hand, had become more deeply committed than ever to child protection work, unable to imagine doing anything else. Our conversations had become superficial exchanges about schedules and obligations. We were living like roommates rather than spouses, polite and considerate, but no longer truly connected. The passion that had brought us together, our shared commitment to justice and protection of the vulnerable, had become the very thing that was driving us apart. The decision to divorce wasn't dramatic or contentious. It was more like acknowledging what had already happened, accepting that we'd grown into different people with incompatible needs and goals. James wanted a quieter life, maybe children of our own, definitely less emotional intensity in our day-to-day existence. I wanted to expand my impact, take on more challenging cases, continue fighting battles that would never end. We separated in early 1992 and divorced officially in 1993. It was amicable as divorces go. We divided our possessions fairly, neither of us sought alimony, and we maintained respect for each other even as we acknowledged our relationship had run its course. But it was still devastating in ways I hadn't anticipated. For the first time in my adult life, I was living alone. Coming home to an empty apartment after days filled with trauma and crisis was harder than I'd expected. James had provided a buffer against the darkness of my work, and without that buffer, I found myself struggling with depression and anxiety in ways I'd never experienced before. Some nights, I'd lie awake replaying cases from years earlier, wondering if I'd made the right decisions, if children I'd worked with were truly safe, if my interventions had helped or made things worse. The doubt that every social worker carries became amplified in the silence of my empty apartment. My salvation during this period came from an unexpected source, the community of professionals I'd worked with over the years. Colleagues who'd become friends rallied around me, inviting me to dinner, including me in social activities, reminding me that I had a network of people who cared about my well-being as much as I cared about others. Patricia Gomez, who I'd supervised years earlier and who was now a senior worker herself, became particularly important during this time. She'd check in with me regularly, sometimes just showing up at my apartment with takeout food and refusing to leave until we'd had a real conversation about how I was doing. Patricia understood the work in ways that people outside our field couldn't, and she helped me process not just the professional challenges, but the personal cost of dedicating your life to protecting children. Work became both my refuge and my challenge during this period. I threw myself into cases with even more intensity than before, perhaps using professional obligations to avoid dealing with my personal pain. In 1993, I took on the most complex case of my career, an investigation involving suspected ritual abuse at a private school that served children from wealthy, powerful families. The case was politically sensitive from the beginning. The families involved had significant influence in the community. The allegations were serious but difficult to substantiate, and the media attention was intense. As lead investigator, I found myself navigating not just the usual challenges of child protection work, but also pressure from attorneys, politicians, and community leaders who wanted the investigation handled quietly or, preferably, made to disappear entirely. But the children's stories were consistent and compelling. Their symptoms of trauma were evident to anyone trained to recognize them, and my professional judgment told me that something terrible had happened to these kids. Despite pressure from above and criticism from outside, I proceeded with a thorough investigation that ultimately led to criminal charges against 3 staff members and significant policy changes in how private schools were monitored and regulated. The case took 2 years to resolve completely, during which time I received death threats, had my professional competence questioned publicly, and faced more stress than in any other period of my career. But in the end, the children were protected, the perpetrators were held accountable, and the system was improved to prevent similar abuse in the future. The ritual abuse case taught me about the intersection of child protection and power, about how wealth and influence can be used to shield abusers from accountability, and about the importance of having the courage to do what's right even when it's not what's convenient or politically acceptable. Recovery from my divorce and the stress of high-profile cases came gradually. I began attending therapy myself, recognizing that I couldn't keep giving to others without taking care of my own emotional needs. I started exercising regularly, took up painting as a creative outlet, and began dating again, though cautiously, and without the pressure to find someone to fill the role James had played in my life. By 1995, I had found my equilibrium as a single woman dedicated to child protection work. I'd learned to create boundaries between my professional and personal life, to seek support when I needed it, and to find joy and meaning in work that was inherently difficult and often heartbreaking. The late 1990s brought a new phase of my career, focused on building systems that would protect children long after I retired. At 43, I was appointed as Director of Child Protection Services for King County, a position that meant less direct casework but greater influence over policies, procedures, and resource allocation that affected thousands of children and families. The transition from frontline worker to administrator wasn't easy. I missed the direct contact with children and families, the immediate sense of making a difference in individual lives. But I'd learned that systemic change could multiply my impact exponentially, creating protections for children I'd never meet, but whose lives would be safer because of the systems we built. One of my first initiatives as director was implementing a trauma-informed care model throughout our agency. This meant training every worker to understand how trauma affects children's development, behavior, and ability to form relationships. We redesigned our interview processes, changed how we structured visits with families, and created new protocols for working with children who'd experienced severe abuse or neglect. The changes weren't just philosophical, they were practical and measurable. Children disclosed abuse more readily when interviewed by workers who understood trauma. Families engaged more effectively with services when approached with empathy rather than judgment. Court outcomes improved when judges received reports that addressed trauma's impact on children's behavior and development. In 1998, we launched the Children's Advocacy Center, a collaborative space where children could receive all necessary services in one location. Instead of shuttling traumatized children between multiple offices for police interviews, medical examinations, and therapeutic services, we brought all the professionals together under one roof designed specifically to feel safe and welcoming to children. The center became a model that was replicated in other communities across the country. Delegations of social workers, law enforcement officers, and administrators visited us regularly to learn how to implement similar programs in their own jurisdictions. I found great satisfaction in sharing what we'd learned, knowing that best practices developed in Seattle were helping children in places I'd never been. Personal fulfillment during this period came not from romantic relationships, but from the deep friendships I'd cultivated with colleagues who'd become family. Patricia Gomez and I traveled together, exploring parts of the world where children faced different challenges, but where the fundamental need for protection remained constant. These trips reminded me that child abuse isn't limited by geography, culture, or economic status. It's a universal problem requiring universal vigilance. My parents, now in their 70s, remained proud supporters of my work even as they worried about the toll it took on me personally. My mother would still clip newspaper articles about my awards and recognitions, creating scrapbooks that documented my career with the same pride she'd shown when I brought home good report cards as a child. In 2000, I was diagnosed with breast cancer. The irony of spending my life protecting others only to face my own mortality wasn't lost on me. Treatment required surgery, chemotherapy, and months of recovery that forced me to step back from work for the first time in my adult life. Cancer gave me perspective on what truly mattered. Lying in hospital beds or sitting in oncology waiting rooms, I thought about the children whose lives had intersected with mine over the years. I wondered about Emma, now a young adult who sent me cards every year on the anniversary of her rescue. I thought about Marcus from the task force case, whose death still haunted me. I reflected on the hundreds of other children whose names and faces I carried with me. Recovery from cancer was slow but complete. Returning to work in 2001, I brought renewed energy and focus to my role as director. I'd been reminded that time is finite and precious, that the work we do matters precisely because life is fragile and children need protection that can't be delayed or compromised. My final major initiative before retirement was creating a mentorship program for new social workers entering child protection. Too many good people left the field within their first few years, burned out by the emotional demands, and overwhelmed by complex cases they weren't adequately prepared to handle. The mentorship program paired experienced workers with newcomers, providing not just technical training but emotional support and professional development. We tracked outcomes and found that workers who participated in the program stayed in their positions longer, had better case outcomes, and reported higher job satisfaction than those who didn't receive mentoring. Training new workers reminded me of my own early days in the field, of the mistakes I'd made, and the lessons I'd learned through experience rather than instruction. I wanted these younger social workers to have guidance I'd had to find on my own, to benefit from the wisdom earned through decades of difficult cases and heartbreaking decisions. As retirement approached in 2015, I began the process of documenting everything I'd learned over 4 decades in child protection. I wanted to leave behind more than just policy manuals and case files. I wanted to capture the intangible aspects of this work, the judgment calls that couldn't be taught through textbooks, the relationship skills that made the difference between success and failure in protecting children. The transition from active worker to retiree was bittersweet. I was proud of what I'd accomplished, satisfied with the systems and programs I'd helped create, grateful for the colleagues who'd become lifelong friends. But I was also aware that the work would continue without me, that new challenges would emerge that I wouldn't be there to address. Here I am at 69, looking back on a life that's been defined not by what I accumulated for myself, but by what I was able to give to others. I live comfortably in a small house not far from where I grew up, surrounded by books, photos, and memories of 4 decades spent protecting children. My days now are quieter but no less purposeful. I volunteer at the Children's Advocacy Center. I helped create, mentoring social workers who are just beginning their careers. I serve on the board of a nonprofit that provides services to families affected by domestic violence. I write grants to fund programs that might not otherwise exist. The work continues, just in different forms. The friendships I built over my career sustain me in retirement. Patricia and I still travel together, exploring new places and staying connected to the global community of people who dedicate their lives to protecting children. Former colleagues stop by regularly, sharing updates about current cases and seeking advice about difficult decisions. I remain connected to the work that defined my life, even though I'm no longer on the front lines. Some people ask if I have regrets about the path I chose, about not having children of my own, about the failed marriage, about the personal costs of dedicating my life to such difficult work. The answer is complex, but ultimately clear. Every choice has consequences, but I can't imagine having lived any other way. The children I worked with over the years weren't just cases or clients. They were my legacy, my contribution to the future. Emma sends me photos of her children, healthy and happy kids who exist because their mother survived trauma and learned to thrive. Former foster children I helped place in permanent homes invite me to their graduations, their weddings, their own children's birthday parties. These connections remind me that the work we do as child advocates ripples forward in ways we can't always measure or predict. This is what I want people to understand about child protection work. It's not just about saving children from immediate danger, though that's critically important. It's about believing in the possibility of healing, growth, and transformation even in the most difficult circumstances. It's about creating systems that support families rather than just punishing failures. It's about recognizing that protecting children is everyone's responsibility, not just those of us who make it our profession. If my story inspires even one person to become more aware of the children in their community, to speak up when they see something concerning, or to support the professionals and organizations working to protect vulnerable children, then sharing it has been worthwhile. The work of protecting children doesn't belong to social workers alone. It belongs to all of us who believe that every child deserves safety, love, and the opportunity to reach their potential. As I reflect on my life's work, I'm filled not with regret, but with gratitude. Gratitude for parents who taught me that ordinary people can do extraordinary things, for colleagues who became family, for the children who trusted me with their stories, and for the opportunity to spend my life fighting for those who couldn't fight for themselves. The little girl who watched her mother help Tommy all those years ago could never have imagined where that first lesson in compassion would lead. But that's the beautiful thing about dedicating your life to service. You never know how far the ripples will spread or whose life might be changed because you decided to care.